In the final part of my previous lecture, I spoke of John of the Cross primarily on the basis of some of his poetry. In this lecture, I'll be looking primarily at his prose commentaries on his poems, and will try to give an overview of his teaching about how one comes to full union with God, what he sometimes calls spiritual marriage. This, in other words, is a kind of synthesis of what he wrote in all four of his major treatises, and I hope that hearing the synthesis, which I admit will be somewhat cut and dried, will lead you to turn to his own works and read them. As you no doubt know, two of these prose commentaries, The Ascent of Mount Carmel and The Dark Night, were commentaries on one single poem called Dark Night, and they were written out of his sadness at seeing many persons fail to make progress in what he calls darknesses or trials. Fail either because they did not know how to proceed, or because they received harmful advice from their spiritual directors, or because they lacked the requisite courage. His other two treatises, The Spiritual Canticle and The Living Flame of Love, were occasioned by requests from other people for explanations of the poems that had the same two titles, Spiritual Canticle and Living Flame. As regards the Canticle, it was the Carmelite nuns at Beas who asked for such enlightenment, which John first gave them in the form of conferences, and later, at the specific request of the prioress, in the form of a complete written commentary. The request for a full commentary on the poem The Living Flame of Love came from a laywoman, the same one for whom John had written that particular poem in the first place. He later revised these two commentaries so that we have both the Canticle and the Flame in two redactions, but for our present purposes, those differences are not significant. In all of my quotations from his work, I'll be using the translation by Father Kieran Kavanagh, published by the Institute of Carmelite Studies in Washington, D.C. Now, in all of his works, but especially in The Ascent and in The Dark Night, John makes frequent reference to a basic distinction in the human psyche, or he would say soul, between what he calls the sensory part and the spiritual part. He also calls these the lower and higher parts, respectively. The former refers most simply to the five senses and the various objects by which these senses derive pleasure, and the latter, the spiritual part, refers above all to those so-called higher faculties of intellect, memory, and will. Both parts of the soul must be purified if one is to attain full union with God. And this purification involves not only courage and effort on our part, but even more importantly, God's own purifying action. All of this purification, he says, can be called a night inasmuch as it causes the faculty concerned, whether a sensory one or a spiritual one, to be in a state of darkness or emptiness. He gives some simple examples to clarify his meaning. For example, he writes, "By depriving itself of its appetites for the delights of hearing, a soul lives in darkness and emptiness with respect to this sense faculty. The purifications that we undertake are called active. Those that God effects in us, he calls passive. And so we end up with four different kinds of night altogether. An active night of the senses, which he discusses primarily in Book 1 of The Ascent of Mount Carmel. An active night of the spirit, which he discusses above all in Books 2 and 3 of The Ascent. A passive night of the senses, Book 1 of the Dark Night treatise, and then A Passive Night of the Spirit, Book 2 of that treatise. In fact, as you perhaps know, things are not nearly so clear-cut in the way John actually presents his teaching. But I think the outline I've just given at least corresponds to what he says he will do, and as a rough approximation, it can be helpful. The purifications wrought by these dark nights are a prerequisite for that joyful union with God that's the main theme of his other two treatises, the Spiritual Canticle and the Living Flame of Love. And if it is primarily God who brings about this purgation, John's very clear that we must do our part as well, though certainly with the help of God's grace. I think the clearest expression of this comes in his commentary on stanza 2 of the Living Flame, where he writes, "It ought to be pointed out why so few reach this high state of perfect union with God. The reason is not that God wishes only a few of them to be so elevated. He would rather want all to be perfect, but he finds few vessels that will endure so lofty and sublime a work. Since he tries them in little things and finds them so weak that they immediately flee from the work, unwilling to be subject to the least discomfort and mortification, it follows that not finding them strong and faithful in those little things, God proceeds no further in purifying them. Such souls are in need of greater constancy and fortitude than they showed." Now, in the first part of the Ascent, treating above all this active night of the senses, John discusses at great length the various kinds of willful, inordinate attachments that have to be overcome. It's not necessary for us to go into all the divisions and subdivisions that he introduces, but it would certainly be useful to hear some of the eminently clear examples that he uses to drive home his point. And so in chapter 11 of Book 1, he writes, "Some habitual voluntary imperfections that are never completely conquered are an impediment not only to divine union, but to any spiritual progress as well. Some examples of these are the common habit of being very talkative, a small attachment one never really wishes to conquer, for example, to a person or to an article of clothing, to a particular book or cell, or to the way food is prepared, or to other trifling conversations and little satisfactions, and so on. And the reason why even these small attachments must be overcome, he goes on to explain with a famous simile. He writes, "It makes little difference whether a bird is tied by a thin thread or by a cord. Even if it's tied by a thread, the bird will be held bound just as surely as if it were tied with the cord. That is, it will be impeded from flying as long as it does not break the thread. Admittedly, the thread is easier to break, but no matter how easily this may be done, the bird will not fly away unless it breaks it. And this is the lot of those who are attached to something. No matter how much other virtue they have, they will never reach the freedom of divine union." That's what he's always after, freedom. And as for overcoming these or any such inordinate appetites, he gives various counsels, the most important of which, and you have this in the anthology, is to have what he calls the habitual desire to imitate Christ in everything one does, for his only will was to do the will of the Father. John further advises renouncing and remaining empty of any sensory satisfaction that is not purely for the honor and glory of God, and doing this out of love for Jesus. The purpose of all this, including those maxims of seeking not the easiest but the most difficult and so forth that I referred to in my previous talk, the purpose is simply that one can come to genuine and complete freedom only in this way. However trying the path, the goal of the journey is one that John assures us is utterly desirable. His final words in this first book of the Ascent are, "Until the sensuality is stilled in such a way that the appetites do not war against the spirit, the soul will not go out to genuine freedom, to the enjoyment of union with its beloved." And I turn next to this active night of the Spirit. As I said earlier, by this term spirit, John means above all the faculties of intellect, memory, and will, a triad that figured prominently already in the works of St. Augustine, including that section on De Trinitate that you read in the Anthology, also in St. Bonaventure and many other earlier authors. For John, each one of these three faculties is to be purified by one of the three theological virtues: faith purifying the intellect, hope the memory, and love the will. It's in regard to the first of these three, faith purifying the intellect, that John's apophatic leanings are most evident. Although all creatures, he says, carry with them a certain relation to God and a trace of God, still there is no essential likeness between them and God. Rather, he says, the difference that lies between his divine being and their being is infinite. And so intellectual comprehension of God through any creature is impossible. There is no proportion of likeness. What is needed, he goes on to say, is a higher kind of knowledge, namely what is called contemplation or mystical theology. And the only sure foundation for this is faith. Faith, he says, is the only proximate and proportionate means to union with God. For the likeness between faith and God is so close that no other difference exists than that between believing in God and seeing God. Just as God is infinite, faith proposes him to us as infinite. Just as there are three persons in one God, faith presents God to us in this way. Hence, the greater one's faith, the closer is one's union with God. And since faith is now perfectly grounded and established through Christ and the gospel, he says that it would be pointless, counterproductive, and indeed harmful to go seeking after special revelations or visions. In one of the most crucial parts of the entire treatise, The Ascent of Mount Carmel, John says that in giving us his Son, his only Word, God spoke everything to us at once in this sole word, and has no more to say. Those who would now desire to question God or receive some special vision or revelation are guilty not only of foolish behavior, but also of offending God by not fixing their eyes entirely on Christ, and by living instead with the desire for some other novelty. God could answer them as follows: if I've already told you all things in my word, my Son, and if I have no other word, what answer or revelation can I now make that would surpass this? Fasten your eyes on him alone. And then in a parallel way, the memory is purified by the virtue of hope. This does not mean that one should forget things that are integral to one's obligations, though John does admit that if someone's memory is entirely absorbed in God, at the beginning that person might exhibit some deficiencies in behavior. I think he has in mind what we would call the absent-minded professor type. But again, just as with the sensory appetites, the real issue is one of attachment, not memory as such. He writes with all possible clarity that people are not required to stop recalling and thinking about what they must do and know, For if they're not attached to the possession of these thoughts, they will not be harmed. With such detachment, one can expect and trust that God will more and more take over the operation of the memory and all the other faculties, with the result that one will perform only fitting and reasonable works. For, John writes, God's Spirit makes one know what must be known and ignore what must be ignored, remember what ought to be remembered, and forget what ought to be forgotten. Thirdly, the will be purified by the theological virtue of love or charity. Here, John first set out to describe the way love purifies all four of the basic emotions of the will: joy, sorrow, hope, and fear. But in fact, he ended up spending so many pages on the various kinds of joy that he never got around to treating the other emotions. In fact, he simply stopped writing the Ascent of Mount Carmel. See, he should have written an outline first, the way all of our high school teachers taught us to do. Still, what he does say is precious for understanding his teaching. These passions are definitely not described as anything bad. On the contrary, he says they're absolutely necessary to keep the strength and ability of the soul for God and to direct it toward God. But they will do so only when they are so ruled that a person rejoices simply in what is for God's honor and glory. When a person hopes for nothing else than that, feels sorrow only about matters pertaining to this, and fears only God. And just as was the case with the memory and hope, the key point again is detachment, which leads in fact to an overflow of joy, but a joy such as the world cannot give, as we hear in the fourth gospel. John writes in the Ascent, "Those whose joy is unpossessive of things rejoice in them as though they possessed them all. Other people, beholding things with a possessive mind, lose all the delight of them all." And there's no doubt that John himself experienced this. For in one of his so-called sayings of light and love, he has the following lyrical outburst: "Mine are the heavens and mine is the earth. Mine are the nations, the just are mine, and mine the sinners. The angels are mine, the Mother of God is mine. All things are mine. God himself is mine and for me, because Christ is mine and all for me. What do you ask then, and seek, my soul? Yours is all of this, and all is for you. Go forth, exult in your glory. Hide yourself in it and rejoice, and you will obtain the supplications of your heart." John's behavior too reflected this joyful attitude that was the fruit of his detached and liberated spirit. His biographers tell us that missing the lyric country solitude of El Calvario after he was sent to found a student college in the city of Baeza, he acquired some property in the country, so making it possible for him and the young Carmelite students to escape from the bustling city. He would take the friars out to the mountains, sometimes for the sake of relaxation, sometimes so that each of them might pass the day in solitary prayer. At Segovia, he had his favorite grotto, high up on a bluff overlooking a marvelous stretch of sky and river and landscape. He grew to love that spot and would spend much of his free time there. And to sum up his teaching on this active night of the Spirit, there's this fine passage from his next work, The Dark Night, something which is one of many indications that he does not segregate his topics in an overly systematic way. He writes, "Faith darkens and empties the intellect of all its natural understanding, and so prepares it for union with divine wisdom. Hope empties and withdraws the memory from all creature possessions. For as St. Paul says, hope is for that which is not possessed. It fixes the memory on what it hopes for. Hence, only hope in God prepares the memory perfectly for union with God. And charity empties and annihilates the affections and appetites of the will for whatever is not God and centers them on God alone. And so charity prepares the will and unites it with God through love. So much then for at least an overview of what he calls the active nights. Although he had originally promised to treat the passive nights in his treatise, The Ascent of Mount Carmel, as I indicated already, he really never got around to doing that, and instead later wrote a separate treatise on this subject. This other treatise, called The Dark Night, is then a kind of continuation of the Ascent, and should ideally be read in conjunction with it. To show the need for this passive night of the senses, he spends the opening chapters of Book 1 discussing various imperfections which regularly plague beginners in the spiritual life. These are described in terms of the 7 capital sins, and the descriptions show John to have been a keen and shrewd observer of human nature. Of spiritual avarice, for example, he writes, "I knew a person who for more than 10 years used a cross roughly made out of a blessed palm and held together by a pin twisted around it. That person would never part with it until I took it, and that was not someone of poor judgment. Those persons, therefore, who are well guided from the outset do not become attached to any visible instruments or burden themselves with them. They very generously give all that they have. Their pleasure is to know how to live for the love of God or neighbor without these spiritual or temporal attachments. They set their eyes on the substance of interior perfection, on pleasing God, not themselves." And then of anger, he writes, "Because of the strong desire of many beginners for spiritual gratification, they usually have many imperfections of anger. For when the delight and satisfaction of their spiritual exercises passes, these beginners are then left without any spiritual savor. And because of this distastefulness, they become peevish in the works they do, easily angered by the least thing, and occasionally so unbearable that nobody can put up with them." Now, what purifies a person from all such imperfections is what John calls this passive night of the senses. Nothing more than a kind of purification or purgation brought about by contemplation. In chapter 9 of Book 1 of The Dark Night, he gives some classic signs by which one could know whether this purgation is indeed something being caused by God, or whether it's just a situation brought about by some bodily indisposition, or lukewarmness, or some other imperfection. The first of these signs, he says, is that souls undergoing this passive purification do not get satisfaction or consolation either from creatures or from God. The second is that the memory ordinarily turns to God solicitously and with painful care, thinking that the soul is not serving God but turning back because it's aware of this certain distaste for the things of God. And the third is that one is powerless, despite all one's efforts, to meditate and make use of the imagination as was one's previous custom. The attitude necessary if one is truly in this dark night is to liberate oneself from the impediment of ideas and thoughts, and he says, be content simply with a loving and peaceful attentiveness to God, and live without the concern, the effort, or even the desire to taste or feel Him. In going on to explain how this works and why this night is truly necessary, he says, first of all, that it frees the soul from all its vices by quenching its earthly and heavenly satisfactions, darkening its discursive meditations, and producing in it other innumerable goods through its acquiring of the virtues. Softened and humbled by aridities and hardships and other temptations and trials, individuals now become meek toward God and also toward their neighbor. They no longer become impatiently angry with themselves and with their faults or those of their neighbor. Neither are they displeased or querulous with God for not making them perfect quickly. And those who have gone through this night of the senses are ones called proficients by John. Much has been accomplished in them, but much more remains to be done. According to John, the real purgation even of the senses begins with this night of the spirit, since all disorders of the sensory part of the soul are in fact rooted in the spirit and receive from it their strength. The second night, he says, is caused actually by divine light, which in its brilliance blinds the spirit, even as an owl is blinded by the light of the sun. This night is far more severe than the first, and John describes it in uncompromising terms, surely based on his own first-hand acquaintance. One feels that God has rejected oneself. He says the soul suffers such pain and grief that when God tried Job in this way, it proved one of the worst of Job's trials, when he says, "Why, Lord, have you set me against you? I am heavy and burdensome to myself." And John goes on to say that in fact this state will last a greater or lesser period of time, according to the degree of union that God wishes to grant. But if it's to be really efficacious, it will last for some years, though not without intervals of relief. What must always be remembered, he insists, is that this night darkens the spirit only in order eventually to impart light concerning all things, and that it humbles individuals only eventually to exalt them. He says that the spirit must be simple, pure, and naked as regards all natural affections in order to be able to communicate freely in fullness of spirit with God's wisdom. Without this purgation, the soul would be entirely unable to experience the satisfaction of all this abundance of spiritual delight. But when that happens, he speaks of the sheer grace of it. That's a line that appears twice in the poem on which he's commenting. Ah, he says, what a sheer grace it is for the soul now to be freed. This good fortune can be understood only by those who have tasted it. For then such persons will become clearly aware of the servitude and miseries they formerly suffered when they were subject to the activity of their appetites and faculties. They will understand now how life of the Spirit is true freedom and true wealth, and how it embodies inestimable goods. Now the soul can even receive those divine touches that are described in one of the sections of our anthology that prepares one for what he calls the spiritual marriage. And here then I turn to the last section of this talk. In describing it, both in his treatise, The Spiritual Canticle, and in The Living Flame of Love, John is at his most lyrical. He assures us that it brings about a total transformation of the soul in the divine beloved, in which each surrenders the entire possession of self to the other with a consummation of the union of love. This is the reality that allows one to say with St. Paul, "I live, now not I, but Christ lives in me." In the Flame Treatise, the Trinitarian aspect of this spiritual marriage is especially pronounced. He says that the Trinity inhabits the soul, illumining the intellect with the wisdom of the Son, delighting the will in the Holy Spirit, absorbing it powerfully and mightily in the embrace of the Father's sweetness. The fire of God that earlier was experienced as painfully purifying now no longer afflicts but glorifies. Just as fire that penetrates a log of wood is the same that first makes an assault on the wood, wounding it with the flame, drying it out, stripping it of its unsightly qualities until the log is so disposed that it can be transformed into fire itself. The death of a person who has reached this union with God will be far different from the death of other persons. He writes that the death of these persons is very gentle and sweet, more gentle than was their entire spiritual life on earth. For they die with delightful encounters of love, resembling the swan whose song is much sweeter at the moment of death. Perceiving even dimly what this state of full union with God entails would surely make a person willing to undergo all the purifications of which John writes. For his only aim in describing those is to let his readers know what of the night is necessary before the dawn and the full noontime of spiritual marriage. A time when he says the soul feels in this state that God is so solicitous in regaling it with precious and delightful words that it feels that everything God does is for that soul alone. And with this feeling it proclaims with the bride in the Song of Songs, "My beloved belongs to me, and I to him." And as for the value of this, John says that the works of anyone who has reached this point are so full of love that they're far more valuable than anything the person ever did before. That's exactly what Paul is saying in the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Even if I give up my body to be burned, but don't have love, I'm nothing. But with love, even the smallest things are infinitely precious to God. That's why John also wrote in another of those sayings of light and love, and one that we ought always keep in mind, in the evening of life, we will be judged on our love.